I came from Africa and scrubbed floors in an American hospital. Today, I was honored by the President of the United States. Find out what happened between these 2 days. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're from. The sun in Kialubingo didn't rise so much as it exploded. I remember how it used to burn through the clay walls of our hut before the birds even started to stir. There was no easing in the morning, no gentle shift from dark to light, just fire. That was how the day began in my village, hot, loud, and full of urgency. I would step out into the yard barefoot, the ground cracked and warm beneath my soles, and watch my mother squat near the fire pit, her fingers dancing through crushed roots and dry leaves in a calabash bowl. She never rushed, even when the smoke made her eyes water. "Medicine listens to rhythm," she used to say, "not noise." My name is Adelaida Mbonga. I was born in a house made of mud, raised between two forces, science and spirit. My father taught arithmetic and English at the village school. My mother was a healer with the hands of a saint and the temper of a thunderstorm. I inherited both their gifts and both their curses, the love of knowledge and the burden of knowing when it wasn't enough. Even as a girl, I felt the weight of other people's pain. I couldn't turn away. At 19, I used nothing more than boiled pawpaw leaves and a length of bamboo to reset a hunter's broken leg. By 22, I had delivered my first child under a mango tree. No salary, no clinic, just instinct and prayer. We were a proud people, but we had nothing that could stop what was coming. The years I spent in the small medical college in Kampala felt like a dream compared to what followed. I had returned to Kialubingo full of fire, with my father's stethoscope and my mother's calm. I set up a one-room clinic on the edge of the village with borrowed gauze and broken equipment, but the people came. They came limping, coughing, bleeding, and I stayed. I met Emmanuel while treating a boy who had swallowed river water during a flood. Emmanuel was the boy's teacher, but he lingered by the door long after the child was out of danger. He was quiet, always writing in little notebooks, but his silence was not the kind that made you nervous. It was the kind that asked good questions. We married in a simple ceremony beneath a neem tree. There was laughter, music, the smell of plantain and spice. No white dress, no rings, just a promise and a shared purpose. We had 3 children, James, Isaac, and my sweet girl Lillian. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was more than most. For a while, life was full. The clinic grew busier. Emmanuel taught chemistry at the school. I spent my days between births and burns, malaria, and snake bites. My children grew strong. I watched them chase chickens and recite poems about stars they couldn't yet see. Then came the soldiers. It began with whispers. Foreign trucks passing in the night. Schools closed without warning. Rumors of rebels, of loyalists, of ghosts in army uniforms. No one knew which faction was which anymore, only that both burned. We told ourselves it would pass, that we were too small, too remote to matter. But violence does not need a reason, only a route. One morning, Emmanuel didn't come back from school. I found him in the center of the village, crumpled near the clinic like a discarded bag of grain. He had tried to stop the soldiers from taking the young boys. He hadn't even raised his voice, just stood in their way. They shot him twice in the chest. I remember the silence more than the sound, the sudden, sickening quiet that follows senseless death. I knelt in the dirt and pressed my hands against his wounds even though I knew it was useless. His blood soaked into the earth where I had once delivered a child. I don't remember crying. I only remember telling myself the children are watching. Do not fall. That night, I packed what little we had: some dried food, a blanket, my certificates, Emmanuel's worn notebook. I tied Lillian to my back, held my sons by the hand, and walked toward the river. We crossed at dawn, the papyrus reeds taller than my boys. I didn't tell them we were leaving forever. I told them we were going to find somewhere safe to sleep. The refugee camp in Kenya was a maze of tin roofs and murmurs. People moved like shadows, waiting, always waiting. I filled out forms in broken English, wrote our names with shaking fingers. When they asked what I was, I said, nurse. When they asked if I had ever committed violence, I said, only against infection. After weeks of interviews, screenings, and silence, I received a letter stamped with an eagle. Approved. A humanitarian visa to the United States. I did not rejoice. On the plane to New York, I held my children tightly. I wore my only good dress. The seats smelled of sweat and plastic. I had never seen so many lights beneath me. I stared out the window, past the clouds, trying to remember the exact sound of Emmanuel's laugh. The flight attendants looked at me like I might ask for something I shouldn't. We landed in winter. The wind was a slap. My daughter cried. James asked if snow was poisonous. Isaac tried to eat it. I didn't answer. I just looked up at the gray sky and whispered, "We are still alive." They placed us in a shelter with other new arrivals. The mattress smelled of bleach. The heat rattled like a dying truck. I held my children in one bed, the little Bible Emmanuel had inscribed in my hands, to the one who heals with more than hands. The next morning, I walked 5 blocks in borrowed shoes and asked the woman at the desk if she knew where I could find work in a hospital. She looked up, saw my skin, heard my accent, and smiled the kind of smile that isn't kindness at all. "You'll want the cleaning staff, dear." That was how it began. Again. New York did not welcome me. It didn't chase me away either. It simply ignored me, as if I were a shadow on the edge of a sidewalk no one bothered to sweep. We were placed in a shelter in Queens, a square of chipped concrete and noise, where the radiators hissed louder than the people and the smell of bleach covered everything except despair. The room was small, just one cracked window and a mattress for 4 bodies, but it was warm, and it was safe. I'd brought only a single suitcase, my children's medical records, Emmanuel's notebook, and my certificate from nursing school in Kampala, carefully folded inside plastic. I remember holding that paper like a passport, as if someone would look at it and say, "You are already qualified. Welcome." No one did. My first job came through a Catholic center that helped refugees. I told them I had nursing experience. They said, "We have elderly patients who need cleaning." I nodded. Work is work. I was assigned to a woman named Mrs. Hollister in a senior home on Roosevelt Island. Her apartment smelled like boiled potatoes and mothballs. She screamed when I first touched her arm to help her sit up. "Don't steal anything," she hissed. "I won't," I said quietly. She watched me the whole time I cleaned, clutching a Bible in one hand and her handbag in the other. Back at the shelter, I made rice with canned beans. James helped the younger ones with their schoolwork. We all shared one spoon. On Sundays, I took the subway to Manhattan and stood in line at clinics asking for jobs. I showed them my certificate. Most of them looked at the paper for 2 seconds before saying the same thing. "Not from here." One woman even laughed. "If you want to clean floors, try the hospital janitor's office. You'll fit in there." That hurt more than it should have, so I cleaned. I worked nights at a hospital in the Bronx, mopping floors that reeked of sickness, blood, and chemicals I couldn't name. The other janitors didn't speak to me. The nurses barely saw me. Once, I overheard one of them whisper, "Mama Africa's on spill duty again." But the halls reminded me of home in an odd way. The sterile lighting, the slow beep of monitors, the quiet footsteps. Life and death moving past each other, neither speaking. I began studying again at night. I borrowed books from the public library, copied words I didn't understand into a notebook. Tachycardia, intubation, hemorrhage. At first, I could not even pronounce them, but my tongue is patient. I watched American medical dramas with the subtitles on. I rewound scenes over and over, not for the drama, but for the language. I made flashcards with my daughter. I whispered terms into the mop handle when no one was watching. "Do you miss Uganda?" Lillian asked one night as she curled beside me on the mattress. "Yes," I said, "but I miss who I was there more." "Who were you?" I thought for a long moment. Someone people listened to. I failed my first nursing assistant entrance test, then the second. I passed on the third, barely, but I passed. One evening, while cleaning an empty patient room, I found an elderly woman gasping, slumped in a wheelchair. Her tray of food was untouched, her skin pale and wet. A quick glance at her chart told me she had diabetes. No one had checked on her in hours. I pressed the emergency button. I rubbed glucose gel into her gums with trembling fingers. Her breathing steadied. When the nurse finally arrived, she barely looked at me. "You shouldn't touch patients." "She was crashing," I said. "You weren't here." Later, the woman, Mrs. Dwyer, took my hand. "Don't let them forget you." It was the first time since I landed in America that someone thanked me. With the help of an organization for immigrant women, I enrolled in a CNA program at night school. Classes were held in a dusty building with flickering lights and metal chairs that screeched. I sat between a former midwife from Haiti and a woman who had delivered babies in a refugee tent in Syria. None of us spoke perfect English, but we understood blood. We understood pain. During the day, I cleaned. At night, I studied. Sometimes I came home to find James asleep at the table, textbooks open, rice gone cold. Isaac had become restless, angry. Lillian drew pictures of me with a stethoscope. One day, she taped one of them to the wall above my bed. In crayon, she had written, "My mom is a doctor in secret." That made me cry. In 1986, I received my CNA certificate. I held it in both hands outside the community college as snow fell quietly on my shoulders. I didn't take a photo. There was no one to clap, but for the first time in years I felt tall again. I taped the certificate beside Lillian's drawing and knelt to pray. Not a prayer for more. Just a prayer of thanks. The next morning, I put on a clean uniform, tied back my hair, and walked into the world like a woman reintroducing herself. My name is Adelaida Mbonge. I do not clean anymore. I care. And one day they will see me again, not as a stranger, not as a shadow, but as someone who never stopped being what she already was. I arrived in Detroit with 2 suitcases, a new nursing license, and aching knees. My sons had left for college. Lillian, still so quiet, was taller than me now, her eyes older than they should have been. The city felt like an old man, tired, grumbling, covered in rust but still alive. The duplex we rented on Moran Street was cracked at the corners. The stairs creaked, the pipes groaned, and the air inside always smelled like something had just burned. But the rent was low and we had privacy. I didn't need more than that. A roof, a kettle, a bed. The rest, I had learned, could be built from scratch. I started working at Unity Medical Clinic, tucked between a liquor store and a pawn shop, both with bars on the windows and bulletproof glass at the counters. The clinic didn't have enough funding. We never had enough gauze, enough syringes, enough anything. But we had patients, dozens. Some came for medicine. Others came simply to be heard. The first time I walked in with my white coat, the other nurses gave me looks. Not cruel, just unsure. As if they were still deciding what kind of black woman I was going to be. The coat hung too loosely around my shoulders. It had belonged to another nurse, one who had quit after a robbery outside the parking lot. I hemmed it myself. Sewed my name, Mbonga, RN, into the pocket by hand. The stitching was crooked, but it was mine. My first patient was a man named Jerome who had torn ligaments in both knees and hadn't seen a doctor in 3 years. He looked me up and down, smirking. "You even from here?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm here now." That was enough. They started calling me Dr. Mama. At first, I corrected them. "I'm not a doctor." They would shrug and say, "Feels like you are." Eventually, I stopped fighting it. Not out of pride, but because the title meant something to them. Something about safety. About someone who wouldn't leave. Most of the time it was blood pressure checks, infected cuts, pregnancies no one had planned. But there were moments that demanded more. One of them came on a cold Thursday morning when a boy named Deshaun was dumped on the front steps. He wasn't breathing. His lips were blue. A needle still hung from his arm. The other staff panicked. I didn't. I'd seen this before, back home during the epidemic days when we had no time to panic. I gave instructions. I found the naloxone. I injected it. I waited. His chest didn't rise. I whispered to him not because he could hear me, but because sometimes your voice is the last thing a body needs to remember it's alive. Then, a breath. He vomited on the floor. Cursed. Cried. When his mother came, she didn't thank me. She just stared at me, then hugged her son like she would never let go. That was enough. After that day, the community changed how they looked at me. Not the staff, some of them still avoided eye contact, but the people. They started lining up early. They brought their children, their elders, their fears. Word spread faster than any memo ever could. She listens. That was my reputation. I wasn't the most educated. I didn't have the fanciest tools, but I listened. I remembered people's names. I noticed when the tremble in their hand wasn't there last week. I knew when someone needed medicine, and when they just needed someone to care that they were still breathing. I began holding workshops in the evenings, teaching teenagers how to dress wounds, how to check vitals, how to notice danger in someone's eyes. I called it First Aid for the Forgotten. They listened, those kids. They asked hard questions. One girl, Shanice, stayed after every session to ask more. A month later, she brought me a Red Cross certificate. "I want to be like you," she said. "Then be better," I told her. At home, Lillian was drawn again. She covered the walls with portraits, people from the clinic, people from the streets, people who had stories but no names. One day, she handed me a sketch of myself. I was standing tall in my white coat, arms crossed, eyes soft. "You look like a guardian," she said. I smiled, though something heavy stirred in my chest. I had spent so long being unseen that even admiration felt like a weight. One afternoon, I overheard a younger nurse named Melanie grumbling in the break room. She didn't even go to school here. They treat her like she owns the place. I didn't respond. I'd heard worse. But Dr. Kravitz, our old grumpy physician, did. He looked at her and said, "She's saved more lives in this building than anyone else here, including me." Melanie never spoke to me again. That was fine. Outside the clinic, the neighborhood was crumbling. Gunshots at night, broken windows, children selling cigarettes on corners. People disappeared, some into prisons, some into graves, some into their own minds. Still, I stayed. I made house calls when I had time. I didn't wear my coat, just a shawl and gloves and a worn bag of supplies. I sat in kitchens that smelled like mildew. I bandaged old wounds and listened to even older stories. Once, I spent a whole night beside an elderly man who was freezing in his home with a gangrenous foot. I boiled water on his stove. I kept him awake. In the morning, he whispered, "I thought I was going to die alone." "You weren't alone," I said. One day, the city gave me a plaque. I didn't go to the ceremony. I had patience. Lillian went on to art school. James became a doctor. Isaac built medical equipment. Sometimes I watched them together and thought, maybe everything I lost became something they could build on. That was enough. I didn't need the spotlight. I only needed to know I was still useful, still needed, still able to make something out of the ruins. Because even now, years later, I still remember the day they shot my husband in front of our clinic. I still remember the silence that followed. I promised then I would not stop, and I hadn't. The virus arrived like a fog, slow, silent, and then suddenly everywhere. At first, it was just a word whispered on the news, something happening in another country, in another world. Then came the empty shelves, the masks, the fear, and by the time we realized how serious it was, the waiting room of our clinic had already turned into a battlefield. Detroit was hit hard, harder than anyone wanted to admit. The Unity Clinic, our tiny, overstretched, forgotten little place, became a last lifeline for people who didn't have insurance, didn't have connections, didn't have time to wait for a hospital bed that wasn't coming. I was 65 when the pandemic reached us. Everyone told me to go home. "You're in the danger group," they said. "You shouldn't be on the front lines." But I had spent my whole life on the front lines. I couldn't stop now. The first weeks were chaos. No gloves, no gowns, no clear instructions, only coughing, crying, panic, and sirens. We turned our clinic into a triage center with duct tape and hand sanitizer. We saw patients in hallways, in closets, in the back alley. I worked from sunrise until the next sunrise. I brought my own mask from home, stitched together from old cloth and a prayer. I washed and rewore the same uniform for 5 days in a row. My skin broke out from disinfectant. My back ached so badly I began sleeping in a chair. But I didn't stop. One night, a man named Luis came in gasping for breath. His wife couldn't follow. She was coughing too. He kept pointing at his chest. I knew he was afraid. He couldn't talk, but I understood. I stayed with him through the night, holding his hand through double gloves, whispering scripture even when he couldn't hear me anymore. He died at 4:17 a.m. His wife came 2 days later. I didn't tell her the details, just that he fought, that he wasn't alone. She wept into her mask and said, "Thank you for giving him a face at the end." That stayed with me. People began bringing donations, paper masks, homemade sanitizer, instant noodles. The neighborhood formed its own safety net. I helped organize deliveries for the elderly. We made phone calls to isolated patients. Sometimes I just sat outside someone's window and talked to them through the glass. Then, one day, I collapsed. It happened outside the bus stop on my way home. My vision went dark, and I woke up with paramedics hovering over me. Oxygen, sirens, the ER. COVID had reached me too. I spent 5 days in the hospital. Fever, chills, dizziness, a terrible ringing in my ears. I drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes I saw Emmanuel's face. He was younger, standing beside the clinic we once built in Uganda. He didn't speak, but I felt him watching. "You're not finished yet," he seemed to say. When I woke fully, the nurse watching over me began to cry. "You're Adelaida," he said. "You taught my sister in high school. You saved our cousin last month." I nodded, weak. "Then we're even." When I was released, I came home to bags of groceries at my door. Flowers, letters, meals cooked by people I had once stitched or counseled or helped breathe through panic attacks. One letter had no signature. It read, "You held my grandmother's hand when I couldn't. You told her she was strong. She died with that word in her ear. I will never forget you." I cried for the first time in months. When I returned to work, the staff stood and clapped. I hated attention, but something about it made my legs feel stronger. Dr. Kravitz squeezed my shoulder. "We thought you were gone." "I thought so too," I whispered. I resumed work slowly. I trained new volunteers. I started a mobile unit, 2 vans, an ice chest, and a laptop, and we drove into neighborhoods where people were too afraid or too poor to seek help. One night, a man called, begging for help. His girlfriend, Jamila, was 9 months pregnant, and every hospital had turned her away. No test, no space, no time. I arrived in the dark. Her contractions were 5 minutes apart. No gloves, no power, just me, a flashlight, and decades of memory. I delivered the baby on the kitchen floor. A girl. Jamila wept. The child was silent at first. I rubbed her back, held her to my chest, whispered a Ugandan lullaby I hadn't sung in 30 years. She began to cry. The story reached the local news, then the state, then CNN. They called me a hero. They asked for interviews. I declined. "I'm not a hero," I told them. "I'm a nurse. We show up, that's all." But the story traveled. The president sent a letter. The governor called. The city of Detroit declared April 23rd Adelaida Mbonge Day. I didn't attend the ceremony. Instead, I sat with an old woman named Gloria, whose husband had just passed. I made her tea and held her hand while she cried. That night, when I walked home, I saw something that made me stop. On the sidewall of the clinic, a new mural had been painted. It was me, in profile. My white coat trailing behind me like a banner. Above my head, in gold letters, were the words, "Even the wind listens when she walks." I stood there a long time. I didn't smile. I just nodded and walked on. The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope with an eagle embossed in gold. It looked like something you'd receive for a wedding or a funeral, but this was something else. Inside, a letter from the office of the President of the United States. They wanted me in Washington to receive a medal for extraordinary courage and service to the American people. I read it twice, then a third time. I left it on the table for a week. I had never cared for ceremonies. I had spent most of my life walking past red carpets, not toward them. And yet, James insisted I go. Isaac said he'd fly in just to see it. Lillian said nothing. She just held my hand and kissed the top of my head. I bought a new dress, navy blue, simple, clean, a scarf to match. I pressed my white coat carefully, even though I didn't think I'd wear it. My knees ached, my back was tight, but I walked through those Capitol halls with my head held high. The ceremony was quiet, formal, heavy with protocol. The president shook my hand, placed the medal around my neck. Flashbulbs popped, speeches were made, people clapped. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out over the crowd, senators, journalists, doctors, strangers in dark suits, and said, I was not trained for this moment. I was trained to hold hands while people died, to kneel beside beds and clean wounds, to listen. I never expected a medal for showing up. Some in the crowd stood, others just blinked. After the ceremony, I made my way to a table for tea and silence. That's when I saw him, Senator William Hales. I knew his face well, silver hair, perfect posture. He had spent years on television arguing against immigration reform. American health care is for Americans, he'd once declared. Now, here he was, holding a cup of black coffee and looking older than I remembered. He approached me. "Your words," he said. "They reminded me of what we forget." I nodded but said nothing. "I was wrong," he continued, "about a great many things." "I know," I replied. That was all. 2 days later, I was back in Detroit, unpacking my suitcase, drinking ginger tea. My white coat hung on the chair. The medal was tucked in a drawer next to Emmanuel's old notebook. Then came the emergency call from Metro General, a VIP patient, cardiac arrest, post-op, short-staffed. They'd needed an experienced nurse for temporary cardiac monitoring. I was on the list. I almost said no, but I didn't. When I arrived at the hospital, I pulled up the file and felt the floor shift beneath me. William Hales. A heart attack? Stable now. Recovery uncertain. He was unconscious when I entered the room. Monitors beeped. Tubes ran in and out of his chest. He woke as I was checking his vitals. Groggy, confused, then still. "You," he said. "Yes," I answered. A long pause. "You're here," he whispered. "I am." "You could have said no." "I could have," I agreed. I adjusted the drip, checked the oxygen. Silence settled again. Then I looked at him. "I don't treat politics, I treat people. And you are not your speeches, Senator. You are a man with a failing heart." His eyes filled with something like shame. Maybe recognition. I stayed for the rest of the shift, monitored his breathing, called in the surgical tech, updated the chart. When I left the room, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only peace. Later, he gave a public statement. Thanked the hospital, thanked me by name, called me a woman of extraordinary character. I didn't respond. Instead, I went home and started something new. A scholarship fund named after Emmanuel for immigrant women pursuing nursing. I used my savings, a grant, and a quiet donation from someone I didn't expect. Anonymous, but the handwriting on the check looked familiar. We launched the fund in the clinic's back room. No press. Just folding chairs, a pot of tea, and 3 young women holding application forms with trembling hands. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter to my granddaughter, Zawadi. "My dearest child, one day the world may ask you to explain yourself, why you speak the way you do, why your skin is the color it is, why your eyes are so steady. Do not answer. Just show them how you care. I was born in a place where people died because no one came. I became someone who shows up. You come from me. That means you already carry the strength of those who have healed with nothing but their hands and their hope. Be firm, be kind, be the light in the window when someone is lost. That's all we're ever asked to be. Yours always, Grandmother." I folded the letter, placed it on the shelf beside Lillian's old drawing of me in a white coat. Outside, the street light flickered on. I stood by the window, holding my tea, watching a neighbor across the street help his mother inside. She moved slowly. He waited, and I smiled, because I knew what I had become. Not a name on a plaque, not a headline. I had become what I always hoped I would be, a woman who stays when others walk away, a healer, a witness, a heart that chooses to open, still standing, still here, still the light in the window. subscribe for more, watch the next one, share this video if it meant something to you.